Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. In today's podcast, I talked with Dr. Alan Rubin about research and social work practice. You might recognize the name Rubin from the widely used social work research text, Rubin and Babby, or as it is officially known, Research Methods for Social Work. In addition to the Rubin and Babby text, Alan Rubin has authored well over 100 publications, most recently focusing on evidence-based practice. Since so many of us have learned research from the Rubin and Babby text, myself included, I thought it would be appropriate to interview Alan Rubin for the very first social work podcast on social work research. I'm excited about offering a series on social work research because research is essential to good social work practice. Most practitioners I know have an impressive command of assessment, diagnosis, intervention, and the myriad of factors that go into providing services to clients. These same practitioners get fairly lost in even the most basic research articles and couldn't distinguish an ANOVA from a logistic regression to save their life. And full disclosure, I had a really hard time doing that too before I went back for my Ph.D. So I thought I would take this opportunity to find out what research concepts Alan Rubin thought were essential for social work practitioners to understand. During our interview, Alan made it clear that there are at least an entire textbook's worth of research concepts that social workers should know. He was kind enough, though, to identify and define a few concepts that he thought social workers needed to understand in order to be informed consumers of empirical research. These included reliability and validity, sources of error and measurement, and researcher and respondent bias. He also talked about these concepts within the framework of evidence-based practice and distinguished the process of evidence-based practice from evidence-based practices. And now, on to the interview with Dr. Alan Rubin on social work research for practitioners. So, Alan, thanks so much for being here and talking with us today about social work and research. And first question, how did you get into research?
Well, I got my master's degree a long time ago with a major in community organization. I wanted to be like Barack Obama. I didn't know Barack Obama in those days, of course. But I wanted to do pretty much the same thing that he was doing. When he first started out, I ended up getting a job in a community mental health program, and I was doing various community outreach mental health kinds of work, and they also wanted me to learn how to be a family therapist, and they were training me to be a family therapist. We were being told at that time, this was back in the very early 1970s, actually it was right around 1970, we were being told that we should view all mental health problems as family problems, that there were no sick individuals, there were only sick families. And as we now, and we were there were no exceptions to that, even for things like schizophrenia. And as we now know, that's way off. That's wrong and that's harmful. But at the time, that's what we were being taught. I was being trained in that. I remember sitting in the in-service training session with two very prestigious psychiatrists, and after being in the training for quite a few weeks, if not months, and hearing much of their lectures, seeing their videos, reading their materials, and so on, I got the courage amidst a room full of psychiatric residents to ask a question, which was basically what scientific evidence they had that this stuff that they were telling us to do was really effective. And one of the psychiatrists responded by simply gazing at me, rubbing his beard, being silent for a moment, and then sort of looking around to the others and then at me, and then saying something to the effect of, that I should look inward to think about what personal insecurities I have that would prompt me to need such certainty.
So he tried to do a little psychoanalysis on you there in the moment.
Right. He tried to defend his own lack of evidence for what he was teaching by trying to make me the problem. So that was one of quite a few things that I was experiencing and observing in those days, one year or so after getting my MSW, that made me feel that, I really want to go back and get my Ph.D. and learn how to do evaluation research to see what really helps people and whether this stuff that we were being taught is really helpful and so on. And of course, as most people in our field now know, research that was just beginning to come out at around that time and really blossomed throughout the 1970s and 1980s showed that calling families of people with schizophrenia the cause of the schizophrenia was not only helpful, but it was harmful. And, I don't need to elaborate on that. I'm sure that people already know about that stuff. But
we actually did a podcast. I interviewed Carol Anderson, about psychoeducation.
Right, yeah. At any rate, I think that's kind of, interesting that the question I asked was on that topic, and then all that research came out showing that stuff. At any rate, so that's how I got into research. I went back and got my PhD to learn how to do research.
Okay. And you said evaluation research. Could you clarify for somebody who might not know what evaluation research is, what that means? What some of the parameters are for what evaluation research is?
Yeah, it's pretty broad. And in fact, in my book, I make the point that, in its broadest definition, it's hard to distinguish evaluation research from just social work research. And back in the old days, most people thought of evaluation research as outcome research, evaluating the effectiveness of programs, policies, interventions, and so on. But it's really, and I still feel just personally that that's the most important part of evaluation research. But it's much broader than that, and it has to do with any kind of research that can be useful in informing practitioners, administrators, and so forth about how to improve what they're doing, whether it might have to do with monitoring who's using their services, whether services are being implemented as intended. It might have to do with qualitative studies on processes in programs. It might have to do with needs assessment. What do clients need? What are the needs in the community that aren't being met? So in other words, in addition to being used to evaluate whether programs are being effective, it could be used for the purpose of planning programs. What services should we provide? What needs are out there? Monitoring program implementation, and so on, beyond just evaluating outcome. And naturally, if you only evaluate outcome and don't evaluate implementation, and it turns out that things aren't as effective as you had hoped, the question would be unanswered as to whether the lack of effectiveness has to do with the idea itself, the theory of the intervention. It may be a great idea, a great intervention that just wasn't implemented properly. So evaluation research covers all of that, and some of the best evaluation research looks simultaneously at implementation and outcome.
So it sounds like it serves at least those two purposes and probably others as well.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that evaluation research, as it is now defined, and you mentioned in your book, and I'm assuming you're referring to Rubin and Babby, the research text that most schools use.
Right.
That evaluation research, the way it's defined now, is almost synonymous with social work research.
Yes.
And I was just wondering how you might distinguish social work research from research in other disciplines?
Well, the easy answer is it's evaluative. And what that means is that social work research is guided by the needs of social work practice. It's meant to guide social work practitioners to give them the information they need to provide better services. It is not generated by abstract theoretical questions, but rather by the practical needs of social work practitioners and agencies.
Okay. So really very practical research as opposed to maybe some of the other research that is done in other disciplines that might be considered maybe fundamental research that doesn't have specific applications that people can think of off the top of their heads.
Right, but the boundaries are ambiguous. People in psychiatry, psychology, nursing, counseling, and social work could all be doing a research on, for example, whether a particular form of intervention to treat sexually abused kids is effective. That would certainly be social work research, but it would also be psychiatric research. It would also be psychological research. I think the main difference is that in fields like psychology, there's a greater likelihood that research might not be guided by the practical questions. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot of overlap.
Okay, sure. And that makes sense because I think ultimately all disciplines would say that we're just trying to help people.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that one of the things that seems to distinguish social work research, or is a hallmark of social work research, is that the research is there to help the practitioners to do their jobs better. And I was wondering if you could talk about what you think of as some of the most important research concepts that a social work practitioner should know about.
Okay, and let me answer that in the framework of evidence-based practice.
Okay. And what is evidence-based practice, if you could define that?
Evidence-based practice is a process that involves approximately 5 steps. First, the practitioner identifies a question and a need for information that they have. What's the best way to intervene with a particular type of client? How do I improve the utilization of my shelter by homeless people, and so forth? I mean, there are an infinite number of possibilities. So it begins with a question. Then the second phase is searching, mainly through the internet, professional literature databases, to find solid evidence, research evidence, that provides scientific evidence to guide the answer to the question. The third phase is to appraise the quality of the evidence you find in terms of things like its validity and so forth. The fourth phase is integrating that appraisal and the evidence you find with your practice, expertise, and your knowledge of idiosyncratic client attributes. Because it just might be that the stuff with the best evidence isn't going to fit your client, or maybe it doesn't fit what you're able to do. And so you have to say, well, that's nice, that's plan A, but it's not feasible, or my client won't go for that, so I got to go to plan B and look for something else. So in other words, it's not just the research evidence itself that guides what you do, but it's the integration of the best evidence with your expertise, your practice expertise, and client attributes. And based on the integration of all that, you make decisions. You make decisions that, can I go with plan A? If not, what's the next best thing I can do that might be more feasible and that may not have quite as good evidence as plan A? It's still got some good evidence and I can do that. Or you might even have to go to plan C. And then the final stage of the evidence-based practice process is monitoring the outcome whether it's an intervention or a policy or administrative procedure or whatever it is, monitoring what happens to see if the desired outcome is achieved. It may be, for example, that the intervention with the best evidence supporting it isn't going to work for your particular client. So it's important to not just implement the intervention and say that's it, but you got to see what happens. You got to evaluate and then perhaps modify what you're doing based on the outcome of the evaluation. So that's evidence-based practice, and that often gets confused with the plural term evidence-based practices, which refers not to the process, but rather to a list of specific interventions that some people have found to have been supported by good evidence.
Like, for example, dialectical behavior therapy is often cited as an evidence-based practice for women with self-harming behaviors who have a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder.
Right.
That would be an evidence-based practice among the list, but that's not what you're calling the process of evidence-based practice. Picking that is not necessarily the process of evidence-based practice. It's merely implementing something that has been identified as an evidence-based practice.
Exactly. Okay. And it's the process that you go through that leads you to pick that or something else that is the evidence-based practice process. And that process definition fits the original intent of the evidence-based practice movement. But over the years, it's gotten confused, particularly when managed care companies come to practitioners and say, here is a list of seal of approval interventions, evidence-based practice interventions, or evidence-based practices that we'll reimburse you for. And then practitioners often misconstrue evidence-based practice as being that list as opposed to a process that if they went through might lead them to go back to that insurance company, that managed care company, and say, hold on, the evidence supporting this particular intervention was based on studies that didn't involve any clients with comorbidity. And with comorbidity, there's evidence that maybe something else might be better, and so forth. So it's real important to distinguish the process from the seal of approved lists, the list of seal of approved interventions.
And it really sounds like what you're talking about the evidence-based process. I mean, it sounds like the research process. I mean, it sounds like, you ask a question and you try and gather the evidence to find out what's been done before, and then you try and evaluate, you try something and evaluate whether or not that's worked. I mean, it sounds like the research process.
Right, except that you're not doing the original research. The process that you're going through is finding and appraising the research that others have done. And then, of course, you're implementing research techniques in the final stage when you're monitoring what happens after you implement the whatever it is that you decide to do. Now, that then sets the framework for your earlier question. There's so many things to know, and here are the things that I think are really, really the most critical within the evidence-based practice context. That would be, one, understanding measurement, validity, and reliability, understanding sources of error in measurement, things like social desirability biases, the way interviewers or researchers can bias respondents in the answers they get, how they could be biased in the ratings, and how people could be biased in what they tell you. So understanding measurement bias, sources of error in measurement, particularly bias, and understanding the concepts of reliability and validity, so that if you are engaged in the evidence-based practice process and you read a study, you can accurately and critically appraise whether its results should be taken seriously or not, given the measurement procedures that were used. For example, one of the early studies on EMDR was based on a therapist continuously asking the client on a scale from 0 to 10 how much distress they felt. And over a 90-minute interview, having your therapist ask you that umpteen times is going to put a lot of pressure on you eventually to say you're not nearly as distressed at the end of the interview of the therapy session as you were at the beginning, even if you feel very distressed, because to say otherwise would be to insult the therapist and to make yourself look like a failure as a client and like you're wasting your money. So that's one example of how both the therapist and the client could be experiencing all kind of bias in responding as to whether the therapy is helping them.
And that's an example of social desirability, for example?
It's social desirability bias on the part of the client, and there's another term on the part of the therapist that I think it's called experimenter expectancies, where the person that's collecting the data is, if not explicitly, certainly implicitly pressuring the client to give them the answers that they want to hear. So there's bias going on both ends. And I cite that as an egregious example. Here's another egregious example. There was a study published not too long ago evaluating the outcome, the effectiveness of an intervention with kids that were delinquent. And one of the things they looked at was whether the intervention was successful in motivating the kids to do their homework. These were kids who were at risk for delinquency. Maybe they were already referred to for delinquency. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But there was obviously reason to suppose that these kids probably weren't going to do their homework very often without an intervention. And part of the intervention was to pay them, to give them a monetary reward for doing their homework. Now, how do you think the researchers collected data on whether the kids were really doing their homework, these kids that were being paid to do their homework? Well, I couldn't believe my eyes when I read the article. They simply asked them.
It was self-report with these delinquent kids who were getting paid to be part of the study.
Yeah, and they were saying, yeah, well, they were doing their homework more after the behavioral intervention was implemented than before, when they weren't getting paid. And that's another example of an egregious bias. Now, I think it's important for social work practitioners to learn to distinguish between egregious, or what I would call fatal, flaws and minor flaws that are more acceptable. And so that's one area of measurement. The measurement, I think that's real important, that they understand these concepts of measurement, error, bias, and so forth. Reliability, if you're asking people from another culture questions with language that they don't fully understand, you're going to get haphazard responses that don't mean anything because they don't understand the language. Same thing if you're using big words with kids that they don't understand. They might say, yeah, I agree, or I disagree, or whatever, just to say something without really knowing what they're answering. So that's the reliability concept, the validity concept, and the bias concept and measurement. Real important. The other really critical concept that I think they need to learn is this concept called internal validity, which has to do with what's really causing what. When a study is done to evaluate whether an intervention is effective and clients have improved from pre-test to post-test, what really caused the improvement? If you go to survivors of Hurricane Katrina in the immediate aftermath of the disaster and assess their trauma symptoms that they're experiencing at that time, and then compare that to how they're feeling a year or so later, you don't have to do any intervention to find out that with time, most of them are going to be doing better. Now, some of them are going to get full-blown chronic PTSD and not be doing better. But if you're taking a representative sample of all Katrina survivors, not everybody's going to have PTSD, not everybody's going to get PTSD, but most of them, perhaps all of them, are going to have trauma symptoms in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, trauma symptoms that, if they don't develop into full-blown PTSD, are going to ameliorate over time. Now, if you just do a pre-test, post-test study, and you supply some kind of trauma intervention, you're going to find that they're doing better after they get your intervention. But what really caused it? Was it your intervention, or was it merely the passage of time? Or was it other contemporaneous events, such as family members, friends, and so forth from other areas coming to their aid? And then there's this concept called statistical regression that you could read my book about. I won't go into that here. Time does not permit that. So there's a whole slew of things that could be explaining why people are doing better after they receive an intervention, a program, or a policy than they were doing before. And so when you, as a practitioner, engage in evidence-based practice, looking at the research to see, hey, what really works, what's really effective, you need to be able to distinguish between those studies that adequately controlled for these alternative explanations versus those studies that did not. And it means looking at this, whether they were internally valid, did they really control for those things, and as I said earlier, what measurement procedures did they use? How reliable and valid and unbiased and objective were those measurement procedures? So those are the things. I mean, there are many, many things to learn about research, but if I had to say what are the 2 or 3 most critical things for practitioners to know, that's what I would say, and that's what I emphasize when I do continuing education workshops for practitioners on evidence-based practice.
Well, I appreciate you distilling the thousands of concepts out there down to perhaps the most important ones for practitioners to know. Because I know that there are a lot of practitioners that listen to this podcast, and I think sometimes the sheer number of research concepts can be overwhelming to folks in the field. So I appreciate that. I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.